Hi there, I'm Rick Partlow. Welcome back to How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck, the YouTube series that has no illusions about making you a great author or how great of an author I am, just wants you to write science fiction that doesn't suck, which may sound like a modest goal, but I've read a lot of science fiction and for some people it's pretty difficult. Okay, having gotten back in the swing of making these videos, I want to talk about something that I might have touched on originally when I started making this series, but I want to really delve into it today. And that is the feel and atmosphere of your book, the aesthetics of your universe. And when I say aesthetics, I don't just mean like choices about whether or not you have faster than light travel or whether you have AI robots. I'm talking about, if it was a movie, I'd be talking about whether you're looking at a world that is clean or dirty. And you may take a while to show that in your book, but there are shortcuts, and you can show immediately in your science fiction novel whether your world is Star Wars prequels or Blade Runner, for example. Some people like the 1950s silver rocket, gleaming jumpsuit, silvery wall type of science fiction where everything is sterile and clean and there are robots that clean up your mess and everything looks really neat and I don't know the word I'm looking for. There is a word, but it looks like something that's not made for people. Antiseptic, that's the word I'm looking for. Sorry. As a writer, I'm not a talker, so sometimes I have a word I'm looking for and it'll just be hanging out there and it takes me a couple seconds to get it. So the 60s had kind of an antiseptic look to their worlds, their world building. Space stations that are all gleaming silver and on the inside they're spick and span clean, and the same thing on the ground. It's, if you ever heard the song IGY by Donald Fagen, the world that he's describing in IGY is that kind of a world, a spick and span, antiseptics world with every surface clean and everybody with a smile on their face, unless it's a dystopia, in which case everybody's got a frown on their face and the robots are ruling them. But you know what I mean. You understand the type of world I'm talking about, like in the Star Wars prequels where everything is CGI and gleaming. Or you have on the other end of the spectrum, as I was saying, like Blade Runner. You have a world where it's dark and raining and polluted and muted. The colors are muted. The light is muted. Everything seems to have like an oily, dirty finish to it. And the society goes with that. It's a society full of corruption, full of lost hope and hopelessness. It's full of broken dreams. And the biggest dream you can have is to get off planet and get away from it. Until the end of Blade Runner, the theatrical version, where they get in a station wagon and drive into the mountains where everything seems nice. And why don't more people live there? No, don't get me wrong. I love Blade Runner. And actually the theatrical version is my favorite cut. But that ending did feel very tacked on, which it was. It was borrowed from another movie, honestly. So when I started writing science fiction, I had a lot of influences, but the biggest two when it came to aesthetics, when it came to the feel I wanted my world to have, were Blade Runner and Aliens. Aliens definitely affected the aesthetics and the atmosphere of the military portions of the science fiction books I wrote, starting in the 90s and going on from there. Duty, Honor, Planet, the first commercial-ish book I wrote, and first military science fiction book I wrote too, very much draws an aesthetic from Aliens. It's like, what would Earth be like in the Aliens universe, you know? Which unfortunately we never got to find out, because they cheaped out on Aliens 3, which was supposed to be the aliens go to Earth, but they couldn't get the budget for it. So they made that travesty that some people like, oh, it's not that bad. No, it's bad. It's horrible. It's one of the most disappointing movies ever made, because they do something that I consider an unforgivable sin, no matter how well made your movie is. If you have a sequel to a classic movie, a movie that means something, a movie that touches people, a movie that people just love as one of their favorite movies, and the first thing you do in the start of that movie is undo everything that happened in the second movie, then you deserve all the criticism that comes your way. And I will never think of Alien 3 as anything except a huge letdown and a poor excuse for a movie. Feel free to disagree, but I know people hate Alien 4, Alien Resurrection, and I can understand that. It wasn't a great movie, but it wasn't as disappointing as Alien 3. Spoilers, I don't mind the fact that Ripley dies in the end of Alien 3. What I mind is the fact that they kill two of the best characters from Alien 2, and they don't kill them in a dramatic, meaningful way. They kill them off screen before the movie begins. That is just so incredibly cheesy and cheap, and I cannot even begin to express how angry that made me when I watched that film. It took everything I had not to walk out of the movie. Okay, getting back to the subject, Aliens and Blade Runner, they had this grimy, gritty feel to their worlds. Like if you ran your fingernails down the surface of that universe, it would come up with, grit and dirt underneath them. That is exactly what I was looking for in the universes I was writing. I didn't want them to be as dystopian as Aliens. I didn't want them to be hopeless, but I wanted them to feel really lived in. And I say realistic, but when I say realistic, I mean there's faster than light drives and aliens and all that stuff, and who knows if any of that's real. And maybe I'm putting a different spin on realistic, but I wanted it to feel like a universe that was made by humans and populated by humans, real people, not not like in the Star Wars prequels where everybody except the main characters could have been part of the background, who didn't really have a life until they interacted with the main characters. I wanted a world where every character lived a life and left their imprint, and where politicians were as corrupt as politicians usually are, and criminals were criminals, and the police were only marginally effective in shutting down criminals. And I wanted it to be like, where big corporations were out for themselves. And that's the kind of world that, we live in. And it's not a dystopia, at least I don't think it is. But it's also not a utopia. It's not a clean, science fiction-y, silvery, antiseptic surface. So that was the aesthetic I was looking for. Now, whether or not that's the aesthetic you are going for, it depends on you, on what kind of a story you want to tell. If you want to tell a throwback to those 1950s science fiction stories, maybe you want something, I don't know, nostalgic, I guess is the word I'm looking for. You want something nostalgic of Lost in Space or Star Trek, where everybody wears, the glittery toga and trousers and the zip-up boots, and their walls are clean, and the robots scrub everything, and everything's brightly colored. That's another thing, by the way, is the coloration. That's a more movie thing than it is a book thing, but you can use it in your book, if for nothing else than in your head, how you see your world. Because you can have a gritty, atmospheric universe without it being the muted, dark colors of Aliens or Blade Runner. Now, I'll give you an example of that. The Fifth Element. The Fifth Element, if you look at the world they live in, it's got incredible pollution, incredible inequality, the super rich and the wage slaves who get, fired en masse by Zorg, Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg. Just says fire 1 million workers. And yet it's not a dark and brooding universe. It's a colorful and, I don't want to say happy universe, but it's a colorful and upbeat universe. The people in it, even the criminals, are campy almost. They're living in a world that they know is corrupt and unequal and, I don't know, almost dystopian, but they also live in it. And I think that's why people like The Fifth Element, is that it has all the trappings of a dystopian Blade Runner type universe, and yet the people in this universe aren't brooding and sulking and just waiting to die. They're living their lives. They're wearing the bright colors. They have corporations that are trying to keep them happy, so they'll spend more money. So they have these commercials. It's not a realistic universe by any means. Obviously, you got so much campy, stupid stuff. But when you look at the world today, there's a lot of bad things going on, a lot of unhappy people, and yet people wear bright colors and dye their hair bright colors, and the commercials are all happy and hey, look at this man with this debilitating disease, but if you take our drug, you can go out and go sailing and go to the Bahamas and play with a steel drum band. It's that kind of a universe where things are bad and people know they're bad, but they don't want to live like they're bad. And you can convey that in your book as well. There's several books I've read that kind of fall into that category. The one that comes to mind is Only Forward by Michael Marshall Smith. It's a really hugely underrated book. It's a book that you go into it thinking it's one thing, and then it quickly becomes another, and then it becomes another, and you really don't see the twist at the end. I mean, maybe you do, but I did not. So that's a world where it can be brutal, it can be hopeless, people die horribly and one after another, and yet the society in the book, well, really societies, because there's more than one, most of them don't have a downbeat, everybody's just sitting around waiting to die attitude. They all have a tendency to try to make the most of the world they're in, and that's realistic. So anyway, that's my point on that. That even if you do have a dystopian, brutal, hopeless world, the people in it are not necessarily going to act like they're in a dystopian, brutal, hopeless world. They're going to try to make the most of their lives. And that's part of the atmosphere too. That's part of the aesthetic. Like I said, you can do it both ways. You can do the Blade Runner universe where things look hopeless and everybody in that universe seems to sleepwalk through life. Or you can do it the Fifth Element way, where everything's brutal and hopeless, but people are laughing and acting happy and trying to make the best of it. Okay, that's the look of your universe. Digging deeper into it, the look of the universe can be dirty, the realism that's dirty and grimy, or it can be the realism that's artificially sweet, like Fifth Element, where everybody tries to make things look good, but it's really bad. Or, as I said before, you can go with the nostalgic, hopeful. The government is mostly honest. The corporations are mostly innovative. The heroes are heroic, and the bad guys are mustache twirling. And you can go with that kind of a look and feel to your series. That's an aesthetic all of its own. And there's one other aesthetic that kind of splits off from that, and it's not quite the same thing. and that is the aesthetic of really, it's mostly of hard science fiction books from what I've seen. It's a Greg Benford, David Brin, science-y universe where everything seems to be more based on research and science, and if corporations are involved, they're looking to use the science to make a profit, obviously. If the military is involved, it's like they want to make sure the science isn't used against them or as a weapon, or they want to use it as a weapon. But in those books where the science is everything, you seem to run into, and maybe it's because just the books that I've read, but you seem to run into a society built around that is kind of the downside of the nostalgic 60s silvery clean society. It's a antiseptic society where people are more ants in an anthill. It's like, if you can imagine Star Trek, where everybody has their purpose and money is not important, except later in DS9 and other places where they have to invent money to make it important, because even they realize that you can't tell a story to humans where there's no money involved. But they're in Star Trek, everybody's got their little purpose and they're kind of happy little insects in a hive. Well, in the hard science fiction of authors like that, which is mostly like a 70s and 80s thing, the universe is also, clean and antiseptic, but it's not a good thing. It's like kind of neutral. Like, I don't want to disparage these authors because I'm sure they did this on purpose and it wasn't for this, but you could mistake it for feeling like the author didn't want to describe the society around them, that the science was the only important part of the book, and they just dropped the science into a kind of a metal can, that they could describe as sparely as possible. That is a choice, and it's obviously can be successful if you write the rest of the book well enough and you know the science well enough. You can get away with kind of making a paint-by-numbers society around your science. If that's not important to the plot, then don't beat yourself up trying to invent a society from, the present to 1,000 years in the future, down to every fashion trend and car model. If that's what you're looking to do, then you use as little description as is necessary to make the book work. Because if most of the book takes place on a space station in orbit around Jupiter, what's going on back on Earth isn't going to matter quite as much, So anyway, that is my short version of aesthetics in your novel. My advice for somebody starting out is to pick a well-made and memorable movie or TV show, and don't copy it. That's not what I'm saying. Don't copy this movie word for word, but think of that in your head when you're thinking of how to make your society. Think of this movie or this TV show and say, this is kind of the vibe I'm going for. This is the atmosphere I want. Don't copy the world from The Expanse. If you put Belters and the UN and Mars and make them all in a power block, well, that people are going to know where you got that from. But you need to have in your head if you want to use that as a model, you're thinking of a society that's very unequal, and there are like levels of power and wealth and privilege on Earth, and then you go out in space and there's still levels of power and wealth and privilege, but the most powerful are kind of living like, only middling people on Earth because there's just not as much resources to draw from in space. And then you go to Mars and it's a society of almost religious fanatics. They're fanatically devoted to terraforming Mars. So that's a kind of structured, tiered society you want to write. Then you can keep that in your head, and you write your society with like kind of a template that you drew off that. Or if you want it to be like Blade Runner or like Aliens. And the great thing about Aliens is you don't really know what's going on Earth, so you can invent whatever you want. But you can take the feel of the Nostromo from Alien and the fact that obviously capitalism is still a thing because they have corporations, because they're working for one. And then you go to Aliens and you've got the military, and the military is very much Vietnam-y in that one. But you can take that kind of a vibe and create your universe. So that's something to keep in mind. You keep in mind like a template in your head, not to copy, but just like a kind of the aesthetic vibe for your universe. If you're keeping Blade Runner in your mind and you're writing about a city, don't make it rain all the time because that's kind of a giveaway. Although in Birthright, I did make it dark and rainy for months because they're on a planet with a slow rotational period, and they have these huge storms that come up during the dark period. So it was a very noir novel. So it was very much drawing off Blade Runner in that it's dark for like 3 weeks at a time, and it's storming the whole time. And that's kind of cool if you're writing that kind of a novel. And if you want to have a happier one, well, they also have 3 weeks of sunshine and blooming plants. So there you go. But just keep that in mind when you're describing your world. And more than even the description of the world, the mindset of the characters. Are they resigned to the life that they have been, the hand they've been dealt by life? They're resigned to just trudging along without a single hope in the world? Or are they facing a lot of uphill climbs, but they're kind of place their hope in commercialism and the ability at some point to win the lottery or win that Gemini croquettes contest and Fifth Element and go on a huge vacation to the stars? Or are they hopeful and feel like they're living in the best of all possible worlds, like the suckers in Star Trek? The characters in Star Trek. Anyway, keep that in mind when you are creating your universe. World building is a lot of fun. It's probably the most fun thing about writing, I think. And that's what's really great about starting a new series, is you get to world build the whole thing. And I'm in a position where I've written a lot of long series, and I love being able to take the characters in new places, and just because a long series lets you end things on your own terms. But writing a new series is always fun because you get to build an entire universe, a future history. And it can be cool for you too. Just don't get caught in the weeds, world building for years, and then never write your book. But that's my 2 cents on aesthetics and how you can draw on popular culture and movies to help you set the aesthetic for your universe. I will talk to you next time. If you want to get in touch with me, it's dutyhonorplanet487@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook at the Science Fiction Worlds of Rick Partlow. And also make sure to listen to the Mill SF podcast with me, Josh Hayes, Jeff Haskell, and James Aaron. And listen to my friend Burn Enough's YouTube channel. He does a lot of great stuff on military science fiction.